Since the early days of the first Total War Warhammer game, the community have been crying out for certain factions, only to be denied by the apparent whims and preferences of Creative Assembly in spite of fitting in perfectly to the maps as they exist right now. Warhammer as a tabletop game has literally decades of lore and work put into it, with a vast array of playable factions, so for every faction fanbase that is delighted with the inclusion of their favourites, there is another left disappointed and still waiting for theirs. For example, the Chaos Dwarfs, who looked for all the world like they were going to be added into Warhammer 2 thanks to the frustratingly greyed out space above Deathmaster Snickers's starting location, and Araby, who could slot easily into the Southlands, yet appeared to have been overlooked for reasons of cultural sensitivity. Alongside those, though, you can find one of the most requested factions left unassimilated from the old world, about whom Creative Assembly rarely utter a word. I'm talking about the Dogs of War. This strange hybrid faction of Southern Lords and misfit mercenaries from across the Warhammer world is far more popular and desired by players than either CA or Games Workshop would have you believe. And now, with the final Total War Warhammer game finally released and a host of new mechanics added that could be of huge benefit to the playstyle of such a faction, I feel confident that we're finally going to see the Dogs of War added to the series, both as recruitable mercenaries and also as a faction in their own right. In this video, I'm going to take you through some of the details about the Dogs of War and the pre-existing Total War faction mechanics that I would use in order to craft a unique and lore-friendly mercenary playstyle for them, while still giving the option to play a conquest-oriented campaign for those who prefer that in Total War. Within discussion of this faction in the Total War community, there's often some confusion around the name. There are people who use Dogs of War as a catch-all to cover the three loose nations south of the Empire and Bretonnia. These are Estalia, Tilia, and the Border Prince Confederacy. As a group, those nations are more accurately referred to as the Southern Realms. Dogs of War is instead a label that refers to mercenaries who sell their violent services all across the Warhammer world. The reason why they're so closely associated with the Southern Realms is because the greatest concentration of them, as well as their most frequent starting point for their adventures, is the southern realm of Tilia. This country is based heavily upon medieval and early Renaissance Italy, and is essentially a confederation of prosperous city-states, along the lines of real-world cities such as Florence, Venice, Rome and Milan. These are centres of banking, trade and diplomacy, and thus are also hotbeds of intrigue and scheming, politicking and murder, an ideal place for a man with a good sword and the skills to use it. Because Tilia and the Dogs of War are such an intriguing and potentially complex combination to bring to the game, I would expect them to come as their own DLC and not as a part of a Southern Realms pack with Estalia and the Border Princes. The mechanics of the Dogs of War playstyle, as I anticipated, would be drawn largely from existing mechanics that are associated with the Ogre Kingdoms, Cathay, the Vampire Counts and the Vampire Coast, in different ways. Like the Vampirates, I would expect them to be a faction with horde mechanics that would allow them to build up recruitment and resources around their lord and his mobile camp, but I also expect them to be able to conquer territory because, let's be honest, normal horde factions are absolutely wretched to play as, no matter how much mercenary colour they're given. From the Ogres, we'll be drawing the contracts mechanic, for obvious reasons. The Dogs of War are mercenaries and they fight for pay. Contracts will be offered at irregular intervals and influenced by the ebb and flow of conflict across the map, with factions under pressure being more likely to request your services. In my vision for the Dogs of War, the value of the contract on offer will be influenced by both your diplomatic reliability and a new metric that I would add in called Renown, which grows with each successful contract and battle, but diminishes with failed contracts and losses. Accepting a contract will get you a small initial payment as deposit for rendering your services. Completing the contract will then provide you with a substantially larger payment, a buff to your relations with your employer faction, and possibly some extras like magical items. Importantly, I would include a negotiation stage to the contract, along the lines of diplomatic negotiations. Dogs of War generals aren't big stupid brutes like ogres, so they're going to use their wits to secure themselves a better price. On the other end, failing to complete your mission within the allotted timeframe will reduce your relations with that faction, as well as damaging your reliability and renown, which would in turn reduce the quality and quantity of the contracts offered to you. The game could even include a mechanic to return the client's deposit in order to partially offset some of these consequences. Another way in which the dogs could do their mercenary business is by hiring prefabricated armies to fulfill a contract, similar to Cathayan trade caravans. Say your main army is busy and you're offered a lucrative contract by Kislev, but you cannot or do not want to commit your lord and his army to that fight while you have other interests. You would then get the option to hire a new caravan-style additional army that would set out for the target automatically to represent you, potentially attracting some additional units along the way. Now, this sounds overpowered, but it would come with several drawbacks. Firstly, it would add costs in terms of initial recruitment and upkeep. Secondly, you wouldn't get to choose the army configuration, so they might not suit your style when the time comes to fight the final battle. Thirdly, they can be attacked along the route, and you would only get very limited replenishment for them, if any, though you would earn loot money to balance that out. Finally, you don't get to keep the army after completion of the contract, though I would suggest that the Lord could drop back into your recruitment pool for future usage, just as a further incentive. The final key mechanic that I would look to include for the Dogs of War playstyle relates to the recruitment of new mercenaries with which to supplement the core roster, and for that I would draw upon the Raise Dead mechanic of the vampire counts. The core roster itself of the Dogs of War is quite bare bones, with a selection of human troops, plus some basic ogres, dwarfs, etc. It's plenty to be getting started with, but before long you'll probably want some new toys, and this is where the new version of Raise Dead, which I would call something like Rogue's Gallery, would come in. While passing through locations, you would be able to check a recruitment screen for available mercenaries in that province. They'll typically be very limited in number, pricier than your own troops, and related closely to the area that you're travelling through. In the Empire, for example, you might be able to recruit some Outriders or Swordsmen or other Empire unit. In Nagaroth, perhaps a unit of Shades or Dark Riders, and in Norska maybe some Marauders, or if you're lucky, Skin Wolves or maybe even a War Mammoth. I'm sure you can already envision the kinds of wild and varied army configurations that can result from this. It's important to note, though, that recruiting units in this way would not make them available for normal recruitment. So if you have a unit of mercenaries that you especially like, you'll need to protect it, because if you lose it in battle, you won't be able to get it again without travelling through a suitable area and getting lucky with the recruitment pool. Combined, I feel that these mechanics would give you plenty of reason to want to explore the Warhammer world and take on more challenging and distant contracts, to collect fun new units, forge new relations, and really play that roaming mercenary playstyle, while the Vampire Coast semi-horde configuration enables you to still go with a classic Total War Conquest style of play, if you prefer that. The choices and mechanics are all already built into the game, just waiting to be repurposed and combined. When playing as a faction that is not the Dogs of War, interaction with them will be varied. First of all, there will be the obligatory Dogs of War, my lord pop-ups, and have fun wanting to stick your head through the monitor every time you hear that after the first few months, same as happened with the ogres. Essentially, when you have a large battle in an area, afterward there's a chance of a marker appearing on the campaign map which you can pass through in order to have the opportunity to recruit new troops. Only now there'll be a 50-50 split on whether they will be ogres or Dogs of War, with those percentages maybe changing according to your location on the map. If it's Dogs of War though, the selection should be randomised as opposed to the stock units that you get with ogres. This would mean that you could get either their normal core units for your use, with some specialised ones with dwarf mercenaries for a higher price, or perhaps even one of the famous regiments of renown, like Mengil's Manflayers, for a substantially greater cost to reflect their reputation, skill and scarcity. It all depends upon which dogs are in the area and whether you can afford their price. Beyond those pop-ups though, there will obviously be relations to handle with the actual Dogs of War factions. They will naturally be available for hire as mercenaries, bolstering your faction, but at a cost that would not be insignificant. An example of the uses for this would be a faction that lacks ranged firepower, either fundamentally or due to not having the correct buildings yet, hiring Dogs of War cannons to give them an edge. If under real pressure from an enemy, you could purchase the support of an AI army from one of the Dogs of War factions, with a countdown of say 3 to 5 turns for it to be raised and appear at your location, to simulate recruitment and travel time. Of course, this would be a pricey proposition, and the army would be under the command of its own leader, so you would need to seriously consider if the cost is worth it. These are simply my own ideas for how the Dogs of War should play, and not confirmed by or discussed with Creative Assembly. But based upon the mechanics that are already in the game, I consider it extremely likely that they will get some or all of these mechanics to play with, or something very similar and hopefully as all-encompassing and engaging. But what do you think? Do you like my ideas for a Dogs of War faction? Do you have some that you think are better or should be added on top of my own? Are you excited to have Creative Assembly finally cry havoc and let slip the Dogs of War? Stick your opinions down in the comments section to continue the discussion. I'll be back very soon with another video that will guide you through the army and unit selections available to the dogs, their potential legendary lords and heroes, as well as the original regiments of renown. If you're looking forward to seeing that, hit subscribe and the bell icon so you'll be notified as soon as that video releases, and I'll see you then.